felt that the
Oh,
magazine...
just a moment, Mr. Hitchens.
Okay.
Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, as well as president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C. And I have the pleasure of talking to Peter Hitchens, British columnist, journalist, thinker, author of many books. And specifically, we're going to start out by talking about a couple of columns in our Providence that reference Mr. Hitchens, to which he has objected. I believe specifically in my column, I had referred to him as grouchy and gloomy. So I want to give Mr. Hitchens a chance to respond and to explain to us his wider perspective. So Mr. Hitchens, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure. I think sometimes it's useful to, if you find something you disagree with, take it up, because you can then sort these things out. And grouchy and gloomy I may well be. People can judge that for themselves when they get to know me. But sometimes there are things about which it's necessary to be grouchy and gloomy. The thing that I first wanted to raise with you was an article you wrote about the reviews that well, not exactly reviews, but commentaries I'd given on two movies. One, the Dunkirk movie, and the other, the one supposedly about Churchill in the Finest Hour, which I thought were bad films, historically either empty or illiterate, and generally false in their tone. And you took me up, and I have to turn to quote from a thing which you particularly said here, which was that you thought that I might prefer drivel and schlock to this sort of thing, which is absolutely not my point. And my point was these films, the film of Dunkirk, was so bad that as I sat through it, I increasingly wished that the Germans would hurry up and come, because at least they might bring a plot. There wasn't any. There was no historical context. There was no understanding of how the British Army came to be standing up to its armpits in salt water, or what had happened beforehand, or anything to do with it. And there are many films, some good, some superb, which have been made about the Second World War in Britain. Two, in fact, one a 1958 version of Dunkirk, which is far, far more interesting about the political and historical context and about the struggle for morale which was going on in Britain at the time, a Britain which was by no means convinced in 1940 that it had joined the right war. And also brilliant films, probably one of the 10 best war films ever made, such as The Cruel Sea. Particularly interesting to me because my father was in the Royal Navy during the Second World War and experienced some of the things which it shows, and he always found that film to be convincing and persuasive, as is the book on which it was based. I'm not against war films. I'm not against the idea that the young particularly should be reminded of the sacrifice of their elders, but I think this should be done intelligently, and I thought these films were stupid. You also criticized my attitude towards the United States, seeming to suggest that I was in some way hostile to the United States, and this is just simply not true. I lived with great delight in Bethesda, Maryland for 2 years. I had wonderful American neighbors who were immensely hospitable. I spent much of the time traveling through most of the 50 states, and always with fascination and pleasure. But one of the things I learned was this: the United States is not a big England. It's a separate country with its own culture and indeed its own needs. And it's foolish, as far too many British people do, to imagine that somehow there's some sort of shoulder-to-shoulder fraternity between the two countries. They have to have different interests. I don't resent or object to that. If we have different interests from the United States, we should pursue them. And likewise, it's not, for me, the relationship would be a lot better if it was stripped of the false sentimentality of a special relationship which doesn't exist. I thought you were unfair and possibly had trouble to look too much into what I thought about either the Anglo-American relationship or the Second World War before writing the piece. I'd strongly recommend that you read my new book, unreviewed largely on both sides of the Atlantic, called The Phony Victory, which is about the origins of the Second World War and actually the rather awkward relationship between the United States and Britain, which existed at the beginning of the war, which is now largely forgotten. In fact, the brilliant Lynn Olson, a great popular historian, has written a fantastic book about that era called Those Angry Days, which fascinatingly has never been published on this side of the Atlantic, possibly because it would upset too many people, but I don't mind about upsetting people, as you may have noticed. The other thing that I was troubled about was a piece written partly about First Things magazine by one of your colleagues more recently, which dismissed an article I'd written about the shutdown of the British economy, as if the argument was closed, as if there was no disagreement among experts about whether this was a wise policy or not. And my whole point in everything that I said, interestingly, the article that I written for First Things was much more impressionistic about the effects of the shutdown on my home city of Oxford. But my point has always been that experts disagree profoundly on whether this was wise. And I think any intelligent person looking at the way in which this has turned out can see that there are at least serious questions to be asked about whether it was a sensible thing to shut down the economies of the major countries and to subject people to what is effectively mass house arrest, a completely unprecedented measure of quarantining the healthy, which has had enormous deleterious effects on economies and societies throughout the Western world, and which I suspect has had something to do with triggering the very, very strange movements which have arisen in recent days. One for the tearing down of statues, and the other for the how shall I put it, the huge politicization of undoubted occasions of police brutality in the United States. So those are my fundamental objections to what you've done. I thought, well, I'd write to you about it and say, look, we shouldn't be on bad terms without even knowing each other. If we want to be enemies, we might at least know who we're fighting. But on the other hand, you might, if you examined me more closely, find that I wasn't as bad as you thought.
Well, I appreciate that very much. I definitely need to start reading your books. And since you mentioned the current historical moment, there were yesterday on social media many comments about a picture of you at the demonstration in Oxford against the statue of Cecil Rhodes, and you were portrayed as defiantly standing while others took the knee. So share with us about that a little bit, if you could.
Well, I've blogged about this. I've been the recipient of unjustified praise. The event was nothing like as dramatic as that. First of all, nobody took the knee, as the saying goes. They took the buttock. They all sat down, and they were urged to do that for, was it 8 minutes, 46 seconds. And you know the symbolism of that. I didn't sit down, but I was under no real pressure to do so. It was a very good-natured demonstration. Nobody shouted at me or threatened me or told me in any way to sit down. In any case, I was there partly as a citizen of my city. I've been an Oxford resident now for more than half a century, and I know it very well. And partly I was there as a journalist, and journalists are not supposed, according to the training that I had, to give any sort of open expression of the partisanship of things like demonstrations or party conventions. So I didn't. So it didn't seem to me to be a thing that I ought to do. So I've been praised for doing something which actually didn't cost me very much, if anything at all. And it was great fun to get the praise, but I think I have to say it wasn't deserved.
In terms of this moment of iconoclasm, these protests against Cecil Rhodes, the destruction of the statue in Portsmouth to the man involved in the slave trade, the graffiti on Churchill's statue in London, of course, many more examples here in the US. How do you respond to it?
Well, of those, I think the graffiti on the Churchill statue's plinth is the most disturbing. I think most people in this country would have thought probably 10, 15, even 5 years ago, that whatever you might think of his politics and some of his opinions, that Churchill's contribution to the liberty of the world was so great that he should be immune from this kind of abuse. And I thought for somebody to think that it was legitimate to daub abuse on the plinth of such a statue in Parliament Square, which is the symbolic heart, as it might be, of our parliamentary democracy, was quite a step away from what had formerly been the consensus. If that's not something that we all share, then I'm not sure what it is that we do share. And if there's a gulf as big as that between me and the people making the protests, can I really treat them as opponents? And more importantly, because they're in the ascendant now, can they treat me as an opponent, or do they view me as an enemy? And I felt for a long time that the left's view of conservatives has been not that they're wrong, but that they're bad. And it's very hard to have a debate with somebody who despises you, and very hard also to have a debate with somebody you despise. And if society fractures to that extent, is there any future in it? Can you continue a civil society with a level of division that severe? I was extremely frightened by that. The statues themselves, there are varying arguments. I personally am not particularly troubled about the statue of Cecil Rhodes. He was in many ways a scoundrel, and by the standards of today, his politics are pretty repellent. And the statue is also mildly blasphemous in a way too complicated to explain. So I wouldn't particularly object if the college decided, the Oriel College on which it stands, decided to take it down. I wouldn't want to die in a ditch for a statue of Cecil Rhodes. It's not a great work of art by any manner of means. It's quite banal. So there are no real arguments to say that we should make a huge struggle to save it. But I do wonder whether the people who are demanding that it should be pulled down really care about any of that, or whether their desire isn't to obliterate a past which previously existed. And this is what frightens me enormously about Iconoclasm, this desire to obliterate the past, because he who controls the past controls the future, as we know. And if you find yourself living in a country which had abolished its own memories, then it would be a country which it would be very easy for people who are malevolent to manipulate in directions which it shouldn't go into.
Now, you were a very young man at the time, but I believe you have some pretty firm memories of the tumult of 1968. How does 2020 compare to 1968, if in any way?
Well, it compares in one very significant way. When I was a revolutionary Marxist in those years, and I certainly took part in some pretty appalling demonstrations, the worst of the things I took part in were attempts to prevent people from exercising free speech. Those are things I'm actively ashamed of. But the thing was that at that time, what we were doing was opposed pretty solidly by the whole establishment from left to right. Now what you find is that people who take up the sort of positions that I have the sympathy of large parts of the establishment, and indeed of the police, and of the church and the academy. And this is a huge change. At the time, we were quite rightly opposed by what you might then call the establishment. Now it seems to be the establishment has gone so soft that it's prepared to appease and kowtow to these sort of protesters without any real questioning of either their motives or the eventual outcome of what they desire. That's the biggest difference, it seems to me.
So 1968 is the establishment now. Is that what you're essentially saying?
Absolutely, it is. Yes, and I think that's been the great change. But of course, it isn't. People stopped having the sort of hair and clothes that they had in 1968, and they stopped screaming and shouting in the streets, and they embarked on the famous long march through the institutions. And that long march has now been successful. They are there, and so these poor children who now demonstrate as if they were bold and radical and unconventional revolutionaries are actually merely endorsing a revolution that's already taken place.
And stylistically, they seem pretty tame if you look at Paris in 1968, for example.
Well, maybe. I don't know. I mean, the thing is that the Paris in 1968 was mostly about sex. It began with an argument about men being allowed to girls' dormitories at the University of Nanterre, and that, I think, sums up most of what it was about. We all thought in the 60s that we were incredibly adventurous and that we had invented sex, which I think young generations often do think. And what we were doing was perhaps a little bit more original, but it's difficult to think of new styles of student revolution, isn't it? They're all bound to be roughly the same. The first one will always be the most spectacular.
Now,
as with so many things, the first taste is always the most entrancing.
Now, in 1968, you were, I believe, a Trotskyist. You've undergone an unusual political and spiritual journey over the last 52 years. If you could tell us a little bit how you went from Trotskyist to conservative.
But it's
Anglican.
it's not unusual at all. What I've done is what young men have done all down the ages, since Wordsworth. And before that, I was a radical when I was young, and I became conservative when I got older. This is normal. The fascinating thing is not me. The fascinating thing is all those people who were revolutionaries in 1968 and still are. The people who, well into their 60s, attend Rolling Stones concerts. This is the bizarre thing. I have become normally middle-aged and indeed old, and done what everybody in all previous generations, probably since the Roman Empire and the age of Athenian democracy. Young men are radical. They cease to be radical when they get older. I'm a cliche. It's the others you have to ask about. Why didn't they? Why didn't they stop being revolutionaries as they got older? That's the really pressing question.
And you're a communicant of the Church of England now, is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, yes.
And what are your thoughts on the current state of the Church of England?
Oh, I pay no attention to the current state of the Church of England. The Church of England is the 1662 prayer book and the authorized version of the Bible, and some very fine architecture and some lovely music. And the current hierarchy and all the rest of it, I try to pay as little attention to them as I possibly can.
Gives you greater serenity that way.
It's embarrassing to think about them. I don't know that they're not it.
Now, it's safe to say that you are a cultural pessimist, but as a Christian, you must be also a man of hope.
Well, I'm a person of eternal hope, yes, but temporal hope seems to me to be, I think, one of the 19th century popes just used the phrase satanic optimism, a belief in the ability of man to actually create perfection on earth, or indeed to maintain civilizations. One of the hymns we used to sing at school, "The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended, the darkness falls at thy behest," contained this irritating verse in which it said, "Thy throne shall never, like earth's proud empires, pass away." And I used to think, what do you mean? British Empire is never going to pass away? Well, it jolly well did, didn't it? Empires always do, as the United States is discovering, and as eventually the Chinese will discover. Temporal empires always do, and in the course of their passing, the civilizations which are built on them suffer and crumble and collapse. I've seen catastrophe. I was living in the Soviet Union at the end of the communist era. And one of the things I learned from it is that catastrophes happen and that the people survive them. It's not as if the whole world is drowned in fire and then water. That, in some ways, would for many people be preferable. Everything that you knew is taken from you, the society in which you grew up, everything that you believed in, not to mention your savings and your job and your house, and you're left standing there living a life as a ghost of your former self. And these things happen. They have little to do with eternity. I have always been very struck by a very short passage. I'm not as keen on G.K. Chesterton as a lot of people are. There's a short passage in one of the Father Brown stories in which he's asked, in some strange and wistful place, do you believe in doom? And he says, yes, I do. And he also says, we look at life as a man looking at the wrong side of the tapestry, completely misunderstanding the pattern. And I think a lot of the time we do this. Therefore, we don't really understand the effects of our actions. And then he says this really crucial thing: what we do here matters somewhere else. And I'm a great believer, and I'm quite capable of being optimistic about all of that, and saying about eternity and about there being justice in the universe. But that doesn't mean I either seek or expect to find justice or anything remotely resembling it in temporal societies. And I also think that it's irresponsible for grown-up people to be optimistic when all the signs point in the opposite direction. You mislead people into failing to prepare for bad things which they could cope with better. We're too optimistic about material things, too pessimistic about eternal things.
Well, the phrase satanic optimism is going to stick in my mind for a while.
You'll have to look it up. I can't remember which pope it was, but it's stuck in mind.
Peter Hitchens, author, columnist, thinker, thank you so much for a very enjoyable conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks a lot.